Hello, ladies and gents. It is Tuesday, the first day of the month. How do you go about your day? Do you do anything therapeutic to help you get through the day? Do you do something therapeutic, something that you enjoy? What do you do throughout your day that helps you enjoy your day to the best of your ability? Do you look after your well-being, your mentality? We're module A328. How do empires begin? How do empires work? How do empires begin? How do empires work? Do you do something therapeutic throughout your day? On page 186, Empire and Systems of Trade. We would see promised monies or be paid for part of a deal and did not receive that reimbursement or payment. The loss they have suffered shall, in accordance with the circumstances of the matter, be compensated for by those means that are most appropriate. Upon arrival of the ships back in this land, they shall report about the circumstance of the matter to the board of the Admiralty of the quarter where they have landed. Should any members of the Admiralty express themselves in terms that members of this company take exception to, they may lodge an appeal with us on the condition that a satisfactory inventory is provided. The goods shall be received by officials of the company, unless someone other than the company's financial officer makes claim to be the contracting party and claims the goods for himself. Should this happen, the aforementioned goods must be administered and kept safe in accordance with the direction of the Admiralty. It should occur that Spanish or Portuguese ships or those of another enemy attack the ships of this company, and should during such fight some ships be captured. The captured ships and goods shall be apportioned in accordance with the national priorities, that is, shared out to the country, with the admiral being given a fair share, provided that the company have suffered any damage in the encounter. This will be subtracted in advance. The members of the respective um, admiralties where the ships shall have arrived will also be made aware of the legitimacy of the bounty. In the course of any legal challenge, the goods shall remain under the administration of the company, subject to a proper inventory, as mentioned previously, and those who feel disadvantaged by the decision shall be free to lodge an appeal with us. The very existence of the VOC Charter demonstrates the role of this Dutch state not only in trade but in the establishment of overseas territories. Even if those territories were intended only as fortified outposts, were organised very differently to the Portuguese ventures in Asia. This was nevertheless a state initiative and involved a trading monopoly. The corporate structure of the VOC reflected its origins both in terms of local rivalries and the role of the state, just as each province of the Dutch Republic had its own states parliament, which sent delegates to the National States General. So the VOC had 6 chambers based in different maritime towns, who selected representatives each year for the main board of the company. Emma and Gomans, 2021. The structure sought to limit the power and influence of Amsterdam, which was permitted to control no more than half of the company's activities, including building and equipping ships and trading in Asian products. The central board of the company had 17 directors, 8 of whom were from Amsterdam, reflecting the need to keep rival interests on board while also recognising the reality of Amsterdam's pre-eminence. The Dutch excursions in Asia. Having discovered the sea route to Asia, the Dutch were well placed to trade with the spice producing state of what is now Indonesia. The VOC was better capitalised than its European partners. Oscar Gelderblom 2016. It suggests in the years 1601 to 11, English merchants of the East India Company invested the equivalent of 4 million guilders, while in the same period the VOC spent an estimated 12 million guilders on its trade with Asia. Dutch trading ships, accustomed to attacks from the Spanish, were also very well armed. So were more than a match at the sea for the Portuguese and local pirates. Having been founded in 1602, the VOC acquired its first territorial base in 1605 when it captured Fort Dinosa, Senhora da Anansada, on the island of Ambon. From the Portuguese, the Dutch also acquired control of Kota Ambon, a settlement around the fort which had developed during the Portuguese occupation. The Portuguese had hoped to use their base on Ambon to control the production and trade of nutmeg on the neighbouring Banda Islands, but had never succeeded in doing so, largely because of its resistance from a local Muslim population. The Dutch motive in establishing themselves in a fortress of Ambon appears to have been the same as that of the Portuguese. They wanted to establish a monopoly of the trade in nutmeg. To do that, they needed to control the land and the people, monopoly through a mix of agreements and force in select areas of Ambon and other islands. Production of nutmeg and other spices was left in the hands of local farmers, who sold their produce to the Dutch via village leaders at a fixed price. Production areas with no arrangement with the Dutch was declared illegal, and the crops were destroyed by the Dutch soldiers and the indigenous employees. Destruction of the crops was considered more efficient than trying to deck smuggling. The Dutch managed to build alliances with the sultanates of Tidor and Ternate, who accepted the Dutch control of the spice trade, but left to rule other aspects of life within their territory. So long as they controlled the trade, the Dutch did not feel the need to establish absolute control. The Banda Islands, adjacent to Ambon, were the only place in the world until the early 19th century where nutmeg trees grew. One might say it was a natural monopoly, usually for the pre-modern period. The island were ruled by an but often ignored them and continued to sell to the highest bidder. In 1609, the Dutch built a fort to enforce the agreements, but the Dutch commander and his followers were killed, leading to a savage Dutch reprisal that wreaked widespread destruction, after which the Dutch imposed a new contract of peace and friendship. The Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who had been in Banda Neira as a young merchant in 1609, returned to the island with 16 warships and nearly 1,000 soldiers. Cohen's brutal conquest of Great Banda is an inconvenient truth for many present-day global historians eager to ascribe agency to indigenous peoples through various forms of negotiating and resisting empire. Yet the powerful differential between Europeans and certain native groups in Asia and the Americas is something that we ignore at our peril. At the time, many Bandanese clearly underestimated the VOC's determination to secure a monopoly of the spice trade and the enormous resources which it could marshal against a weak, isolated polity, of course. There were plenty of areas in the modern world where Europeans struggled to get a foot in the door. But the Banda Island was not one of these places. Cohen's punitive expedition resulted in a near total destruction of Bandanese society. 48 Awonkayas were captured, tried and exalted at his order. Their relatives, nearly 800 100 years old, men, women, children, were shipped off to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, the VOC headquarters in Asia, where they were put to work as slaves. In the end, they were about 1,000 of an estimated 15,000 original inhabitants left on the Banda Islands, just as it happened after the 1606 conquest of Pulau Way. The arable land on Great Banda was divided into plots called Perkin and distributed among European tenants. Many of these so-called Perkineers were former VOC soldiers together with company officials. They would form the upper crust of the new colonial society for centuries to come, in cultivating and harvesting the valuable species. They could dispose of a large labour force of slaves imported by the VOC from all parts of Asia. The Dutch conquest then marked a fundamental break in the past. Jan Peter Zoon's Cohen's actions, nowadays referred to by many as genocide, come in for some criticism in the Dutch Republic at the time, though he was not censored by the VOC or Central States General. In our article, Van Itterson emphasised the role of Anglo-Dutch competition in Indonesia, which placed the indigenous population in a difficult position, faced with one European power that imposed trade agreements, and the other did their utmost to persuade people on the island to break those agreements. The headquarters of the VOC in Asia was Batavia, a city on the island of the Java built upon the side of a small port called Jakarta, previously part of the Banten Sultanate. This site was conquered in 1619 by forces commanded by Jan Peterson Cohen. Initially, a garrison town protected by walls and fortifications against attacks from the Banten and Martaram Senates, as well as the English and Portuguese. Batavia grew into a substantial city with Dutch institutions, but a varied population, it also acquired substantial hinterland. Rich manors were granted to Dutch settlers, resulting in Batavian aristocracy lording it over coffee and sugar plantations beyond the mainly Dutch areas of Batavia. These separate settlements, they were under the authority of the VOC's governor, but were populated by Chinese, Indian, and Indonesian settlers. Having killed and driven away Jakarta's inhabitants in 1619, Governor General Cohen proposed to populate his new city of Batavia with Dutch burghers. His plan never came to fruition, and Batavia remained a multi-ethnic society with a small European minority. In 1632, the population of Batavia was only around 8,000 people, about 2,500 of whom were European or of European origins, either VOC employees or free colonists, and they were only 250 married couples in which both partners could claim European origins. In the first half of the 17th century, Dutch authorities categorized their non-Dutch subjects as enslaved, Mardiker, mixed race or Chinese. When the Dutch arrived in Asia, they immediately began to participate in the existing trade in enslaved individuals, and the enslaved quickly made up 20 to 40% of the population of Batavia. By the end of the 17th century, half the population of Batavia was enslaved until the 1660s. Most of these slaves come from India and had prior contact with the Portuguese. Batavia was also home to a Christian population, as Mardi Kiers. Such people were formerly enslaved individuals who had been manumitted, and their descendants, and had their origins in Portuguese controlled parts of Asia. Although Dutch authorities conceived of the Mardjekir group of a distinct legal category, they actually felt a great deal of uncertainty about where this category ended, and a category of mestizo, a person of mixed race origins, began, and Dutch authorities often lumped people from these two categories together in a group known as inlands. By 1700. Batavia's population had grown to 70,000, but only 6,000 of its people were European, and while Chinese, Indian slaves, Mardi Jakirs, and mestizos were still the majority of the population. Many Malay speakers from the Indonesian archipelago itself had entered the city's multi-ethnic society, either voluntary as labourers or involuntary as slaves. Anxiety about this diverse society was often brewing below its superficial tranquil surface. The city's design was meant to create and reinforce social distinction by establishing separate quarters for different classes within the city. Wealthy residents of both European and Chinese descent lived in the desirable south or southwest of the city, while workers lived in the northwest close to the company's warehouses. The coolie slaves, as unskilled slaves held by private individuals, were known, lived in a separate slave quarter, and in 1664 the VOC moved its enslaved people from the fort to its slave quarter. The city's agriculture also attempted to circumscribe the movements of its various groups by limiting the numbers of bridges over canals, which kept people outside the areas in which they did not belong. Indian historian Partha Chatterjee suggested that a key feature of the colonial societies is the role of the colonial difference. Rabin goes on to say European colonialism might not be the inventor of racial segregation. However, it was indeed one of its most thorough subcontractors. There are a wide range of studies concentrating on the propensity of the colonial regimes to classify and separate. The tendency to separate did not stop at the division between colonizers and colonized, but also extended divisions of indigenous subjects. The Dutch were not unique in classifying the inhabitants of the territories they ruled. So too did the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the English and French. Some European proponents of empire suggested draw upon the Aristotle, that certain people were natural slaves, and this notion depended on the ability to separate people into categories. Dutch trade in Asia. The Dutch did not confine their direct trade with Asia to spices. As we saw above, the Dutch developed coffee and sugar plantations in Java and sought trading bases in India. Maki Patam on the Coromandel eastern coast was already a substantial and thriving centre of trade, and the Dutch, like the British, French and Portuguese, were permitted to have a factory there in the 17th century, while control remained in the hands of local rulers. Later in the 17th century, the Dutch established themselves further south at the Nagapattinam, when they took control not only of the town, but also of its hinterlands. This enabled them to control the production and trade of cotton and textiles. Having established a factory in 1618 on the west of the coast of India, in Surat, which is the most prosperous port in the Mughal Empire, the Dutch developed numerous branches in the area where were able to develop links with textile producers as a highly developed emporium. Surat required little interference from the Dutch, and indeed such interference would have provoked resistance. In the main, therefore, the Dutch simply decided and traded there. As did many other people from various parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe, the Dutch presence at the Malabar coast in southwest India was more pervasive than in Surat. Cochin, modern day Coquille, was captured from the Portuguese in 1663. The Dutch exerted their influence well beyond their town itself to exercise indirect control of much of the Malabar coast and its hinterland, thus controlling the pepper produced in the area. In addition, the pepper Dutch controlled Kochi also traded enslaved people, primarily other VOC territories such as the Cape Colony in South Africa. The Dutch were able to dominate the politics in their fertile and densely populated Malabar region without taking formal control of any part of it except of Kochi. This was largely due to the presence of about 50 small, extremely diffused yet entwined principalities that were governed by ever-changing coalitions between and within rival, mostly matriarchal family networks of princes, nobles, warriors, traders, and temple servants. This was familiar to the Dutch experience of Sri Lanka, where they ousted the Portuguese in 1656. Like the Portuguese, they were unable to control the whole island, but had instead to deal with the indigenous rulers, notably those of the Kingdom of Kandy. The Dutch, like the Portuguese before them, sought control of the island, trade in cinnamon. There was a huge demand for goods such as pepper, spices, sugar, and copper within Asia, which induced many European traders to become involved in intra-Asian trade. The Dutch in intra-Asian trade in sugar in the 18th century. What does this suggest about the role of the Dutch in Asian trade in the 17th and 18th centuries and the way in which the Dutch projected power in Asia? Of all the European companies trading in Asia, the VOC pursued this commerce of a larger scale. From its inception, the company tried to expand its commercial network and enhance investment potentials in Asian merchandise by identifying areas with surplus production and regions that had a substantial demand for these goods. The VOC authorities in Asia quickly spotted the widespread appetite for Indian textiles. A large demand on the subcontinent for West Asian and Japanese silver and copper, Southeast Asian spices and Chinese silk, and the Persian and Japanese hunger for the Indian silk and sugar. The company soon grasped the opportunities for intra-Asian trade and invested substantial sums in the South Asian pepper, textiles, silk, and sugar. East Asian silk and sugar, Southeast Asian spices, the West Asian silk, fine spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon are by far the most profitable trading items in both Europe and Asia. Its monopolistic control over the producement of these spices from the so-called Spice Island gave the VOC a clear advantage. This enhanced a substantial reciprocal demand which enabled it to have exchanged spices for textiles. Inter-Asian trade was quite attractive to the company. The VOC extensive inter-Asian trade was substantial for the network involving the exchange of a variety of goods produced in different parts of Asia, with a chain of comptoirs factories throughout Asia, from Mocha in the Red Sea to Japan. The company would procure goods from areas of the surplus production and dispose of them in areas with deficits. Fine spices from the archipelago, cinnamon from Ceylon, ivory and tin above all, pepper and sugar were in high demand in South and West Asia. Precious and base metals from Japan were also of crucial importance, but of their utility in coinage, the manufacture of war materials and household items. The Dutch carried on this type of commerce consistently. during the 17th and 18th centuries. This in turn helped the VOC optimise profits earned on the scale of merchandise in Amsterdam. Operating such a far-flung commercial empire was not free from risk, and changes in the composition of trade over time were not unusual. But on a broader scale, the company managed this commerce relatively smoothly as long as there was no barrier to the procurement and transport of merchandise. Since the Dutch experienced great influence over the political economies of the islands of South East Asia, the VOC was able to secure exclusive access to large supplies of fine species. It monitored the production of these species in such a way to make competition difficult. Although the VOC had the powers of a state, it remained above all a trading company governed by directors in the Netherlands with interests were focused upon profits in trade. The extent of right of the VOC fleet meant that the company could engage in all kinds of trade in Asia and could keep control of trade carried out by Dutch officials. It could not completely prevent private trading by its employers, but the VOC achieved more control than its European rivals, as we saw above. Dutch trading empire operated in different ways according to the circumstances, with central organisation of the VOC coordinating overall operation. The government of the Dutch Republic played a key role in setting up the VOC with its charter. But the States General played a role in the day-to-day operations of the company and did not play a direct role in the appointment of VOC directors. Most of the families of political elites and the six elites that appointed directors were also influential in the States General, but rather than placing control in the hands of the central government, this factor helped make commercial considerations more central to the Republic's policies. VOC and the States General cooperated with each in lending the other money and armed ships in times of need. And branding. The Dutch system in Asia then combined a decentralised role for the Dutch state with a centralised approach by the chartered commercial company. The state and company from 1602 until decline set in during the 18th century.